The Winnipeg Jets might be in the midst of a big season, but their kids are also still developing, and Winnipeg's future is looking brighter than ever. Find out what they're up to on tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets.
You're Locked On the Hockey Jets, your daily podcast on the Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey Jets fans, and welcome to tonight's episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host, Harrison Lee, an avid Winnipeg Jets fan and an online blogger. You can follow me on Twitter at HLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. Thanks for making Locked On Jets your first listen of the day every day. If you enjoy what you're hearing, be sure to like, follow, and subscribe on all of your favorite podcasting platforms and YouTube. Doing so, of course, is always free of charge and ensures you never miss another episode. Most of all, though, we just love and appreciate your support. Tonight's episode, we are focusing on the kids once again. It is time for our brief prospect update. We are not going to get to every single prospect in this pool, but if I'm talking about them on this episode, it's probably because I feel they are a little more prioritized, perhaps over some of our other prospects. You know, there's going to be guys in here that we don't get a chance to chat about, but for the most part, we're going to cover the bigger names and a lot of the guys that I think folks are keenly interested in. But before we dive into that, just wanted to let you know that tonight's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. You can start the season off with a big return on FanDuel because new customers can place a $5 bet and get $150 in bonus bets back when they win that first bet. All you have to do is visit FanDuel.com to get started. Now, like I said, the Jets have a nice and deeper prospect pool than I think they tend to get credit for. Will Scouching has called it one of the better pools given where the Jets tend to pick. And, I tend to agree, right? There's a lot of versatility and depth here. There are some positions where you could argue the Jets are maybe a little bit thin, but on the whole, I think this pool has, a fair few NHLers of some level. They may not all be elite, but I think a lot of them are going to be impact players. And up front, right now, the Jets forward group, especially the future forward group, is probably looking pretty darn tasty. Now, I will say that there's not a lot of elite talent in this pool, but I'm seeing a lot of guys who could probably play middle six roles. And given where a lot of the Jets picks are coming over the last few years, outside of the first round or late and in the second half of the first round, that's pretty darn good. The first guy I really want to spotlight, though, is somebody that I think is honestly one of Winnipeg's most underrated prospects, in part because he's been injured a lot. That's Lucius. You know him as really Kyle Connor 2.0, but it's been very hard for him to actually live up to that because for the last 3 or 4 years, he has just had multiple injuries and season-ending injuries in a number of those instances. And finally, this appears to be the first season so far where he's at least staying healthy. Through 7 games with the Moose, he has 5 points. And if you saw a couple of his recent goals, you know that elite release of his is looking better than ever. The thing with Lucius that I think is worth shouting out is that he can play multiple positions. He's a center, he can play as a winger, and he's a super interesting prospect. Among Winnipeg's forward group, he probably has the highest ceiling. And I know people will look at his past couple of years and think, how is he above Brad Lambert or Nikita Triberkov, Braden Yeager, any of those guys? But with Lucius, he always had one of the most naturally gifted tool sets and skill sets. And when he was in preseason and camp, he always stood out very positively. But it was just his health, right? That's literally the one thing that held him back. And recently, it seems like he's bulked up. His skating is above average. He's pretty mobile. And that shot of his is just unbelievably lethal. And so I think I'm really hoping that he has a successful run with the Moose for the next couple of months. I think he's secretly one of the Jets' really interesting prospect call-ups once we start getting to the playoffs. Obviously, for many reasons, there's not a high likelihood that he'll make the Jets this year. I think you want to see a fuller season from him because he hasn't exactly skated in the pros for that long, thanks to the injuries. But I think he's got a really interesting outside shot at cracking this roster at some point. Now, another guy that I think a lot of you are focusing on is Kieron Walton, who has been on an unholy tear with Sudbury to start the year. He right now is leading all Jets prospects in scoring, which, for a lot of reasons, let's not get crazy about the record right now, but as an OHLer who has considerable size, he's racked up 47 points in 28 games, which is well above Kevin He. It's above Braden Yeager. It's above Connor Levis and Colby Barlow. So he is at the top of the Jets junior league scoring, which is really impressive. You look at the way that he's acquiring these multi-point games. He's passing well. He's skating well. He's taking good shots. And I think if you look at the offensive production, there are some goals here that he's scoring that you're just never getting at the pro level. But for the most part, his consistent production and distribution are really impressive. His skating has been good. And from the highlights that I've been able to see, he looks like a pretty well-rounded prospect. When he calls himself a guy who models his game after Tage Thompson, you see it. He's got a lot of skill, and I am personally very excited about him and his potential to impact Winnipeg's middle six. It's also nice that he can play both out wide and down the middle. I'm really hoping that the down the middle part of his game really starts to shine through. You've also got Kevin He, whose scoring pace from the start of the year has definitely slowed down. It's only 1.35 points per game now. Oh gosh. But yeah, I mean, you sort of did expect him not to put up like 2 points a game every game for the entire season. It just wasn't sustainable, but he's still got 35 and 26. He's still rocking it. He's a really fantastic player. I think he's got some real fun potential to be, again, maybe a second or a third liner for the Jets. And that offensive motor of his has put up 20 goals already, which is really impressive. So as long as he keeps developing his offensive instincts, that release that continues to be, maybe not the strongest, but still the placement and shot selection have been very good. I'm excited to see what he can do once he reaches the pros in a year or so. You've also got Yeager, who's been doing pretty decently for Lethbridge. Just a couple of games so far, but 4 points already. And, 34 points in 23 games on the season. Gotta love it. Yeager, obviously, for a lot of folks, is one of our most exciting center prospects, and a player I'm very much circling for Winnipeg's future core. I think this trio up top, has some real fun potential to be names that I think a lot of Jets fans are going to get comfortable with and very familiar with over the next couple of seasons. You've also got Barlow. Barlow has started looking more like actual Colby Barlow, 22 points in 27 games, and they're starting to pop up a little more frequently on the score sheet for him. I still wonder what's going on with him on the whole. I do have questions about his recent production, but still holding out hope that the release of his is enough to get him some sort of an NHL role. I do feel, though, that among the Jets prospect pool, he could make the most sense if you're trying to acquire either a big rental or a player for the present and future, a younger, early to mid-20s kind of type. So while he is improving, he did take a step back this year, and I think it's going to take him some time to get back up to speed. Another guy that I'm interested in is Reshevsky. Reshevsky has popped up recently. Saw on Twitter somebody referring to him. He's started to get his goal scoring back. Obviously, the past couple of years haven't exactly seen him pop off the page, but for like a 24-year-old in the K, 10 goals through 32 games is not terrible. Not great either, though. I've mostly written him off. A big impact role at the NHL level, but I'm still keeping some hope out. Maybe he turns into something at some point. Another guy that, maybe is standing out for perhaps not the best reasons is Jacob Julian. He has really fallen off the pace this year. He's around, a little over half a point per game, 15 and 28. I don't know what's going on with him. I don't know if it's something with the team or if it's just his own personal production. They have, he's not really popping off like he was last season. Dickinson and other guys on this team have really taken over the scoring, and Julian's ninth on the team. So for a guy who should be producing a lot more at this stage of his career, it's a little disconcerting to see him take this much of a step back, but I mean, that's why you take all these picks. I will say that I think the defensive side of his game looked really good in camp, and so at the very least, I think he'll be a solid bottom six player. Now, there's a couple of other guys that I think are worth talking about. We'll focus maybe in a future episode on a couple of other prospect updates, maybe some extra ones tomorrow. Vesalainen could be an interesting one to chat about because he continues to do really well in Liga and maybe just maybe there's a role for him if he ever decides to return to Winnipeg sometime in the future. But, I don't want to talk about him as a guy that I think is going to impact the core in the very near future because, he may not be super interested in coming back overseas. But on the defensive side of things, the Jets pool has been a little bit up and down. I think that there's less exciting stuff here, but a couple of guys, Alphonse Frey continues to be of note, and I think Salomonsson before his injury was raking it up pretty nicely. So we'll chat about who's standing out on the back end and maybe even who's doing well in net and who's had a few struggles in just a little bit. Before we go too much further, though, just wanted to shout out our friends and partners at Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed because they help you schedule, screen, and message so you save a lot of the busy work and connect with candidates faster. And Indeed doesn't just help you hire faster. 93% of employers who use Indeed agree that it delivers the highest quality matches compared to other job sites. And I've actually used Indeed when I was looking for work myself. I can personally attest to the fact that the resume builder is super easy. And when I put in, my work experience and stuff, Indeed automatically matches me very quickly with jobs that not only fit my discipline and experience, but also my salary requirements. And so for somebody who's looking to hire quality candidates, I have to imagine that this is such an easy process and it connects you with candidates faster than everywhere else. That's why 3.5 million businesses worldwide already use Indeed, and I think you should do it too. Listeners of this show will even get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on Locked On Winnipeg Jets. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. While we're here, I also wanted to tell you a little bit about our friends and partners at FanDuel. Get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, new customers can bet $5, and if you win that first $5 bet, you'll get $150 in bonus bets guaranteed. It's a great offer. It's a great opportunity, and the FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on the NFL all in one place. If you're thinking about a couple of games this weekend, Dolphins and Texans could be a very interesting one. I'm going to call this one for the Texans. I think Houston is desperate to try and have some sort of a bounce back from Stroud, and I would expect he has a good performance against the Dolphins secondary that's maybe not as good as it used to be. Ravens, Giants, of course, I'm a Ravens fan. I'm gunning for the Ravens. I think it should be pretty firmly in Baltimore's favor. If we lose to Tommy Cutlets, I'm giving up on the season. But, the real marquee matchup, Bills-Lions, tough game. I would say Detroit is probably favored, but we all know Josh Allen goes ham sometimes. So really good opportunities here. And if you're making a bet, you can be sure that you are checking out the latest stats, viewing live play-by-play, and so much more all on the same page where you're placing your bets. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. And again, you'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. That's only at FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Hey friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Everydayers, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're chatting about the Jets prospect pool and some notes of interest from around the system. For the Jets, the forward grouping I think is probably the most exciting aspect. On defense, it's a little less clear as to how deep this pool is. I would say that the Jets have a couple of guys that could be NHLers. The most promising D prospect is obviously Elias Salomonsson. Salomonsson has been great for the Moose, and until his injury recently, that apparently is not going to sideline him longer for maybe a month. Still a decent amount of time, but not as bad as it could have been. Prior to that injury, though, he was one of Manitoba's top scorers, which that's actually a bit of a worrying sign, but in his own personal performance, great, right? 12 points in 17 games. He was pacing as a top 3 scorer for the team and has really been just an effective puck-moving blue liner whose passing and power play quarterbacking has been of note. For a Moose blue line that's really not super deep, Salomonsson has been a great find. And I was honestly a little shocked at just how quickly he's adapted to the North American pros. I I did say that I thought it would be quick for him, but I didn't really expect the offensive game of his to really jump off the page. 3 goals, 9 assists for a first-year North American pro really is very impressive. I'm super excited about his future. I think that he has a lot of potential. For a kid who is still very new to this ice and is only 20, the fact that he has already hit the Moose roster like a freight train and has really been doing a great job, I think is absolutely worth celebrating. I'm very excited about him. Starting to wonder if maybe he might even be good enough to play alongside Morrissey, and perhaps he does that sooner than expected. Not necessarily because you want him starting there, but because if DeMello really is this level of player at this stage of his career and going forward, that could be a real problem for the Jets. But Salomonsson might immediately become a huge top 4 upgrade. So something to keep an eye on for. Elsewhere, we've got Alphonse Frey, another Swedish defender. He's bounced around. He had a couple of games at the J20 level and then moved up to Allsvenskan earlier this year. 23 games, 7 points. For a player who really isn't playing a lot for Bjorklöven, I hope I pronounced that name. Apologies if I didn't. That's actually really good, right? A kid who's really getting marginal deployments, having 7 points in 23 games already is always what you want to see. I think the biggest thing for Frey is that he's going to want to work on his defensive reads. Obviously we're not watching closely Allsvenskan hockey right now, but I think the biggest thing that stood out in camp was that he was still pretty raw. He's very mobile and very fast, and he can make nice breakout passes. But I think the defensive side of his game, where he'll want to learn how to use interior body positioning better and time his reads a little more carefully, I think is something of note. So watch out for him in like the next 2 to 3 years. I don't know when he'll come over to the U.S. He's still very young, and I think you want to let him maybe have another year in Sweden before you bring him over. He is still only 18. And again, like I said, he's still pretty raw. He's not super small. He is 6'1", but sometimes the frame of his is a little lighter. So interesting player, a guy who I'm definitely keen to watch in a couple of seasons. But again, I would say he's probably a little further off. We've also got another guy that's of interest. That is Garrett Brown. Brown hasn't scored a point this year for Denver, but generally speaking, Garrett's game is going to be one where you probably look at him as kind of like a DeMello-y type, a more shutdown sort of defensive-oriented player who can still move the puck. He's a clean skater, and he can carry the puck and ferry it in transition, sort of like Sandberg. I would like to see maybe the offensive game produce a few more results. I'm not sure if that's just a product of maybe Denver's offense, maybe not being as crazy this year, or what's going on with that. I don't think Garrett's offensive game has ever really been super, super high octane. But you've got guys like Zeev Buim and a few others doing really well. And maybe it's just a question of him being more of the complementary defender than somebody who's expected to be, the big point scorer. So for Garrett, I am interested to see what he does going forward. I think he could be a really solid player for Winnipeg's maybe third pairing, or if he becomes a really good anchoring blue liner, maybe second pairing. But I feel like he never really gets any attention, partly just because he doesn't score lots of points. I have him as kind of like the defensive, shutdown sort of guy, a guy who can be clean and generally avoid getting himself into too many dangerous situations. But will be interesting to see how his game translates at the pro level. And I wonder, how much longer he's going to stay with Denver. So interesting stuff. But outside of that, you've got guys like Kuzman. Kuzman's, got like 3 points in 14 games with the Moose. Lundmark has 6 and 18. With these guys, I tend to view them as like really fringe 7 to 8s at this point. Kuzman's a fun player. I think you saw him in camp be a little impetuous with the puck, and sort of the defensive side of his game hasn't exactly popped out. Lundmark is an all right 7th in my mind, a guy who can, perhaps carry the puck and be an okay 7th, but I don't know that his game really would shine at the NHL level. At the AHL level, he's been fine, but I think if you're asking him to do more, kind of the role and responsibility of what a top 4 NHL defender is going to demand, especially with this Jets team, I don't think Lundmark is really cut out for that. Bauer at this point, yeah, I think Tyrell for me is kind of like the Logan Stanley of the AHL. He's big, he's strong, and that's unfortunately not helping him generate much else, right? His defensive results are poor. The offensive side of his game doesn't really exist, but he's got strong character. He'll stand up for his teammates, and for some teams that can be really valuable. So that's probably what it tops out at, though. In net, things have not been good. If you're Thomas Milic, Milic is rocking an 870 with the Moose this year, which is just not good enough. But I mean, it is what it is. It's an early start to his career, but I did hear some folks kind of express some skepticism about his pro level game, especially as a late blooming goalie. So maybe that's starting to show through. But DiVincentis, on the other hand, has been very good. With the Moose, he had a 930 in 5 games. And with the ads in the ECHL, he's got a 914 in 6 games. So seems like he might be the more likely of the two to have a more rapid pro-level impact. But, at the same time, Hellebuck is going to be in net. You've got Comrie as a backup. So you don't need either of these guys to immediately become an impact goalie for the Jets. But certainly not great signs with Milic early. Again, goalies are voodoo. I don't know how much I'm going to read into this, but I do hope that Milic turns his season around, because like Kakinen with the Moose has been really bad too. He's rocking an 853. And for Manitoba, you want to create at least some level of watchability. And if your goalies are letting in, 4 or 5 goals a game, that's probably not going to be something the rest of the team can cover for. So we'll have to see how that goes. But I will say that up front, at least, I think the Jets have a lot of interesting talent to work with across their lineup. And, the defense is still a work in progress. And, Anton Johannesson not coming through last year, I think was a little unfortunate. I was hoping for more from him. But at least in the meantime, you've got Salomonsson, who I think the Jets are very high on. I'm very high on him. Frey looks good. And you've got some interesting potential, I guess, punt picks in Brown and Kuzman and Lundmark. But I think going forward, the Jets are probably going to try and pick up some more right-sided D. I think you've noticed that it's pretty thin at the pro level for the Jets, and even though they did add Fleury for the left side and Coughlin for the right, you probably want a few more names in the system. So all fun stuff, but, will be a question for a draft in the future, either this year or next. But, of course, for the Jets, one of the things that's kind of come up with an interesting conversation about specifically our defensive side of things, we're seeing a lot more Logan Stanley, and Arniel was asked about it by Murat Atesh, and he was talking about, some of his thoughts. Maybe a player doesn't show well by the analytics, but you want them in for some other reason. And I want to chat about the price of that in just a little bit. Before we go any further, though, wanted to shout out our friends and partners at PrizePicks. PrizePicks is the best place to get real money sports action. With over 10 million subscribers and billions of dollars in awarded winnings, PrizePicks has made daily fantasy sports available to everyone. You just pick more or less on at least 2 players for a shot to win up to 1,000 times your cash. Run your game all season long on PrizePicks, America's #1 daily fantasy sports app. And if you're really wondering why PrizePicks should be one of your first choices, you can make your holidays bigger and brighter with PrizePicks, the best place to get real money action, because they always put their members first with fast withdrawals that are safe and secure. And when you get your picks, if you hit them, you can get your money in as little as 15 minutes. They also offer MasterCard for quick and easy withdrawals and deposits into your account. And they even came up with Flex Play so that you can still cash out even if your lineup isn't perfect. We all like a little bit of insurance, and PrizePicks wants to give you that feeling of confidence. This season is also a great time because PrizePicks is giving away 2 free picks in December, and they're giving away $30+ million in rewards during Pickmas, which is great for Christmas because we all love a few extra bonuses. If you're thinking about something for the upcoming week of Jets hockey, the top line has cooked in the previous game, and I think you can have a decent feeling that maybe Kyle Connor or Mark Scheifele are going to have more than 2 points next week. I think that's pretty fair. I would even go so far as to say, 3 or more points, I think, is a pretty safe bet. But the only way that you can get in on the action is to download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. Again, download the app today and use code LOCKEDONNHL to get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. PrizePicks, run your game. Hey, friends, and welcome back to this episode of Locked On Winnipeg Jets, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Every day, thank you so much for rejoining us on tonight's episode as we're chatting about the Jets and some interesting stuff with Winnipeg's back end, right? Scott Arniel is trying to do a delicate balance of keeping Stanley engaged in the organization and in the lineup while also giving some room for players like Coghlan, Fleury, Heinola to get in. He knows in his head and from the evidence that Stanley analytically lags behind. And he was asked about that by Murat Atesh in The Athletic. And his response is interesting. And I think it gives some level of insight into where Winnipeg as an organization is. When Arniel came in over the summer to try and lead this team, he really said that he wanted to focus with an analytics summit, talk about using more data science. And it does seem like he's doing that, but I feel like he's still held back by some of the things that have always hamstrung Winnipeg. And it's that there are some sunk cost fallacy issues with this team, and they also tend to try and commit to getting the most out of things that maybe they don't need to. And I think Logan Stanley has been a really good case study of that. Stanley, very nice guy, and a player that when you watch him, you never really question his effort. Like Stanley leaves his heart out there on the ice, but unfortunately, the performance hasn't really gotten above maybe a seventh defender, right? What Stanley has been asked to do on the third pairing is be serviceable as a number 5 or a number 6, and he's just not really hitting those hallmarks for me. Heinola, I think, can do the job because he at least can pass on a pretty consistent basis, and you saw his breakout passes last game, one of which actually led to a goal-scoring chance, and one that Winnipeg actually converted on thanks to a good stretch pass from the D zone through the neutral zone. And actually, it was a pass that was so hard and accurate that I thought the receiver was going to miss it, but he actually got it and created an offensive zone possession. And so that skill set alone, I think, puts Heinola above Stanley already. And because Stanley can actually do stretch passes, it's a shame that he kind of misses a lot of them because he does have a good, hard, accurate pass when he's not flinging it into opposing skaters' feet. And that does seem to be a bit of a problem with him. It just seems like he doesn't always pick his head up in time or recognize where the threat is. And, it results in a lot of turnovers. And so that's one thing. Arniel was kind of talking about the size and grit aspect as being things that you want in your team. And I don't disagree with that. I think that can be helpful, right? I'm not really an anti-size or anti-grit or anti-effort person. But by the same token, I have a limit to where I think it starts to become a detriment to your team, right? And with the Jets, Winnipeg doesn't have the luxury of other elite squads out there where they can afford to have more than a couple of weak links. The Jets really have to try to maximize their lineup because they're not built to have the same level of elite talent that everyone else does. They've got a really good assemblage of players, but they don't have like a McKinnon or a McDavid, and that does have an impact when you're trying to compensate for your deficiencies. The Jets have a really strong depth unit and a lot of lines that they can roll, but they just don't have the luxury of having more than like 1 or 2 D pairings that are going to struggle defensively. And right now they're dealing with 2 of them. So actually you could argue 3 of them because it's not like Morrissey and DeMello don't have their own defensive issues. And so with Winnipeg, I feel like in chasing a version of Stanley that I don't really think exists, they are making life actively more difficult for themselves. And I get it. I know why Arniel is trying to make this work, and I see what they want out of Stanley. But if you're asking him to be this big shutdown guy who can also jump into the rush and be effective that way, he's never really going to be that guy. Fleury is an upgrade in that respect, and even Fleury, I really wouldn't want to see starting on a pretty routine basis. I think he's done a decent job alongside Pionk, as much as you can expect of it, but I think Winnipeg kind of needs to cut losses at some point, right? I would love to see a Heinola Miller or a Heinola Coghlan pairing as your third. I think that would be a really effective duo. Hey, Stanley Heinola is not that bad when Heinola is not missing his passes and Stanley is occasionally using his body to cut down passing lanes and stuff. But as a rule, I just don't think that pairing is really what you want when you're heading into the postseason. And, Heinola on his offside is fine. It's just not ideal. And so, I don't know what the evaluation period here is. I don't know what it would take for Arneal to say he's seen enough with this pairing, whether he'll choose one or the other and then put either Coghlan or Miller back in. But I think for Winnipeg, you just have to be smart about how you're doing this. You don't have a lot of room for error. And while this is a great evaluation period, the Jets also don't want to keep dropping games because they have defensive breakdowns. Winnipeg's record is still very good, but you don't want to really cut into it now when you can still pad the lead and get a few more wins out of it, right? So experiment, but do it smartly. And I think keeping the Stanley experiment going probably isn't what I would consider the best investment. But again, I get what they're trying to do. I see why they're trying to do it. I just think we all know how this is going to end. So, if you're going to chase size and grit, make sure that it's still a useful, serviceable size and grit. A skater who can be strong and physical, but still makes the back check, like a Sandberg, right? I think that's a great example of a guy who's strong, who's fast and mobile, but still gritty enough and physical enough to where you'll satisfy the demands of a competitive NHL matchup. But curious to know how you feel about that. Are you upset about some of these decisions? Do you think that the grit and size are enough to trump the lack of skill? Drop your comments below or at my social medias at HLLivingLoco and at LO_Winnipeg Jets. For tonight's episode, though, that's going to be all the time that we have. Thank you so much for listening and making us your first listen of the day every day. We'll see you back here tomorrow with coverage of Winnipeg versus Vegas. Let's hope it's a victory. But for tonight's episode, that is all the time that we have. Thanks so much for listening. Have a great night, and go Jets go.